Hey everyone, I'm Walt, one of the High Rock pastors. One Saturday morning a few years ago, I was playing soccer with a few of my friends at a small park. And the roads bordering the park had all been closed off for an annual bike race. So as we were playing, we could see cyclists constantly looping the park. And these guys were legit. They were geared out, they had super nice bikes, and I could tell they weren't messing around because they rode in a peloton, a super tight cluster designed to maximize speed and keep the race tight. It requires a lot of skill and control to be able to ride in one without crashing and taking everyone out with you. We were having a great time, but then the unthinkable happened. I hit a long pass to my friend, too long. It went over her head and it rolled out into the street. And then out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, the peloton, rounding the corner, heading straight to the ball. Time stood still. I stood frozen to my spot, totally unable to do anything. Other spectators began shouting, "There's a ball in the street," as it slowly rolled along. And I could see in my mind the lead bike hitting the ball, going down and taking out the whole peloton with them. And so I braced and I clenched up, waiting to hear the crash and the screams. And then the peloton just whizzed right by. The ball, thankfully, had rolled all the way to the other side of the street, out of harm's way. Time sped back up, and I grabbed the ball and I got out of there as soon as I could. How is it that such small things have the potential for such great impact? Often we're quick to write them off, and yet we love stories about unlikely, unassuming people punching above their weight. That's why we can't get enough of stories like The Queen's Gambit, Ted Lasso, countless others. For those who are familiar with the Bible, it is chock full of stories of God using seemingly small people to do great things. It seems like that's one of God's favorite things to do, taking people who are on the margins or vulnerable, people who are ill-equipped or have character flaws or a problematic past, and using them to be a force for good and hope in the world. And this morning's passage is another great example. A woman who is beyond unlikely, having a profound impact on her town, and whose story we continue to celebrate and learn from over 2,000 years later. We love stories like that. But is this a story for us? That's a different question. My problem is that I feel small, but with no impact. At least not any good impact. I really get the small part of the equation. It's easy for me to resonate with feeling insignificant, feeling like I can't make a difference even if I wanted to. It's so easy to get trapped by insecurity or feel inadequate or feel like someone else could probably do a better job of things than I could. And besides, it's a lot easier to be aware of the negative impact that I've made more than any positive one. The soccer balls that didn't quite miss the peloton, so to speak. The times I've let people down or didn't live up to my own expectations. When I've just made huge blunders or missteps that have been harmful, and especially when I've totally put my foot in my mouth in conversations around race and culture. The ways that the sins and mistakes of my past still affect my relationships in the present. And forget about making any kind of positive impact. What if I just had a neutral one instead? Zero impact. That'd be great. But for reasons that I continue to grapple with, that doesn't seem to be God's plan for people. Over and over and over again, we are told that God has a vision for life and thriving and hope in the world, and God loves involving people in this process. Not just rock stars or billionaires or influencers, but normal, everyday people like you and me. People who have issues, painful pasts, who might not feel like they have anything to offer to this vision. People who have a complicated history with religion and the church. People who are so new to God and the church that they don't think they could possibly do anything. And people who just straight up struggle with the notion of advancing anything related to Christianity. Why would we want to be a part of anything that has caused so much harm to others? And if, like me, you struggle with a sense of smallness, and if, like me, you have wondered whether or not God could really use you for good in the world, and if, like me, you have questioned whether or not there was anything good about Jesus worth sharing, then I'm glad we're getting a chance to look at this story together. We read the ending first, so we know where the story is going, but in order to really appreciate just how incredible this woman's story is, we need to get back to the beginning a little bit. Last week, Pastor Megan preached about Jesus' conversation with the Pharisee Nicodemus. Shortly after that, Jesus left Judea to head north to Galilee. We read that he had to go through Samaria. And this level of intentionality is super interesting. So I don't live near any Chick-fil-A's, so if I'm within 30 minutes of one, I'll happily make a detour out of my way. I had to go there. I just had to. And it's the same thing here. But Jesus isn't going out of his way geographically. He's going out of his way socially, culturally, religiously. He's about to cross a ton of boundaries, and he knows it. Samaria is on the way to Galilee, but Jews never went through it. They always took the long way around because of the hostility between them and the Samaritans. Samaritans had a different belief system, were seen as unclean by Jews, and at times there had been violence between the two groups. They did not get along, so Jews never went into Samaria, even though it meant going well out of their way. But Jesus was not bothered by that. In fact, he wants to be there. To fulfill his boundary-breaking mission, he had to be there. So he goes in. He sits down at a well outside of the town of Sychar, and there he meets a woman. And he asks her, "Will you give me a drink?" This moment is shocking for many reasons, but all the more so because of how it stands in contrast to the conversation that Jesus just had with Nicodemus. Nicodemus and this woman could not be more different. Nicodemus is a man, a Jew, a teacher of the law. He's at the top of the Jewish social ladder. No one would be in greater esteem than this guy. But the woman is, well, a woman in first century Palestine, and a Samaritan, and doing the household chore of getting water. She's on the bottom rung of this ladder. Yet there is something fundamentally different about their situations. Nicodemus is the one that comes to find Jesus. Meeting Nicodemus didn't seem to be a big priority for Jesus. But remember, Jesus had to go to Samaria. And Jesus is the one who initiates the conversation with the woman. Furthermore, John, the gospel writer, loves developing the theme of light and dark in his gospel. Nicodemus comes at night, in darkness and shadow. But Jesus' conversation with this woman is happening at high noon, the full light of day. And even though she is at the bottom of the social ladder, she is being elevated in the eyes of Jesus. Jesus is willing to cross all the boundaries to have this moment with her. Jesus' readers weren't the only ones shocked by Jesus' request for a drink, and this woman was too. She replied, "You are a Jew, and I'm a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" She knows that this conversation should not be happening. Something very different is going on, and this is where the conversation begins to turn. Jesus doesn't respond to him, "Yeah, hurry up, I'm thirsty." He says, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water." Suddenly, this interaction isn't about his need anymore, it's about hers. She's thirsty for something too. And this is confusing for the woman. Understandably so. I've asked for a lot of drinks in my life, and I've never gotten a response like she did. She's confused, but she's also curious. So she asks in return, "Sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water?" And Jesus answered, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life." Jesus isn't talking about water anymore. He's tapping into a deep, deep need. Phoebe Bridgers won the 2020 Grammy for Best New Artist. She was being interviewed about one of her songs that touches on the topic of faith. And she said, quote, "I have no faith. If I'm being honest, this song is about turning 11 and not getting a letter from Hogwarts. Just realizing that nobody's going to save me from my life. Nobody's going to wake me up and be like, hey, just kidding. Actually, it's really a lot more special than this, and you're special. No, I'm going to be the way that I am forever. I mean, secretly, I'm still waiting on that letter. That I want someone to shake me awake in the middle of the night and be like, come with me. It's actually totally different than you ever thought. That'd be sweet." End quote. Her quote really moves me. She taps into this sense of yearning and longing that is so deep and visceral. For those unfamiliar, the Hogwarts letter is when Harry Potter learns that he's a wizard. He's not a nobody or an outcast. He's not forgotten. He's someone special. And I think that yearning and longing is something that all of us feel at some point, and many of us probably still feel. It may be one of the main things that keeps us feeling small and like we don't have a part to play in any story. It's certainly what the woman at the well was feeling. She had no doubt about the station of her life. And yet now in this moment, Jesus is offering her a gift. Jesus is offering her a life free from thirsting, a life free from wondering, a life free from yearning for something more than she has. He's essentially saying, come with me. It's actually totally different than you ever thought. And this is grace, the free gift of God in Jesus Christ. God's unearned love and delight for all people, including the lowest of the low. And this is another place in which we see the contrast between her and Nicodemus. It's been said that the gospel comforts the afflicted and afflicts the comfortable. Both Nicodemus and the woman got their worlds rocked by God's grace, but for different reasons. As Pastor Megan helped us see last week, grace for Nicodemus was being told that life in the Spirit was a process, not an achievement. As hard as it was for him to hear that, it turned his whole world upside down. For the woman at the well, grace is the Word of God, becoming flesh, crossing space and time and cultural barriers because Jesus had to be with her, had to offer her this free gift of living water. She may be small in the eyes of the world, but to Jesus, she was someone. She wasn't discounted because of being a Samaritan or a woman. She was loved by God and had a part to play in God's story. It's that Hogwarts letter that's written for her, and for you, for Phoebe Bridgers, and everyone who has that same longing that she does. You know, God's grace is free. We've done a terrible job of making it costly. And it's that costly grace that makes us feel so small, because no matter how hard we work to earn it, we will always fall short. We keep making mistakes. We set up standards and expectations for ourselves, and then we miss the mark. Or we let others set those standards and expectations for us. And then when we don't hit them, we disappoint both them and ourselves. God's movement is fueled by grace, and it's so hard to be a part of that if we're just performing for God, performing for others, performing for ourselves. We can't give what we don't have. And I can't count the times that in a desire to make some kind of meaningful impact, I've acted out of my own insecurities, my own thirst. I wasn't trying to bring hope or care to others in so much as I was trying to use them to give me something that I lacked. For this woman and for others, this costly grace meant she never got to be in the game to begin with. The barriers to grace were too high. The cost of entry was too great. In her world, grace was simply unavailable to people like her. And if you're listening with us today and find yourself feeling the same way, that you've been told something about you needs to become fundamentally different to be given grace. It could be your gender, your class, your culture. You could have a complicated past or complicated present. Maybe you've been told that you ask the wrong kind of spiritual questions. Whatever the case may be, I hope that you see here the truth about grace. That Jesus is doing whatever it takes to offer you living water so you don't have to thirst again. And this woman is ready. She replies, "Sir, give me this water so that I won't keep getting thirsty and having to come here to draw water." She may not be fully grasping at what Jesus is getting at, but she wants what he's offering. And at this point, Jesus shifts the conversation in a way that is honestly kind of awkward. He says, "Go, call your husband and come back." When she tells Jesus that she doesn't have a husband, Jesus replies, "Well, you were right when you say you have no husband. The fact is, you have had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you have just said is quite true." What's going on here? Why is Jesus bringing this up, and why now? There's been a lot of speculation about just what the story is with the woman's life. Is she an adulteress who hops from bed to bed? Is she some kind of black widow whose husbands keep dying? Has she been divorced repeatedly? And more often than not, the conclusion drawn from this part of the story is that she's just very sinful. And Jesus wants to make sure that she knows that he knows what's really going on. But honestly, that's a pretty uncharitable read. We don't really know what her situation is. And the reality is that in this patriarchal world, women just didn't have a lot of options. They almost always needed a man to provide for them. So rather than write her off as sinful, we should be quicker to acknowledge that regardless of what the details are, this was not the life that she would have chosen for herself. The only way someone ends up at this point is by going through a lot of pain, loss, grief, and shame. There's a reason that she was at the well at noon by herself. Nobody did that. The common practice was to go at dawn when it was still cool, when you could gather the water you needed for the day. It was a communal activity. So the fact that she is alone in the scorching heat demonstrates that she's an outcast. She's been shunned by her community over her circumstances. And she'd rather face the noontime desert sun than the condemning stares and whispers of the community that had rejected her. But she was seen by Jesus. And when Jesus brings out this truth about her life, it wasn't a gotcha moment. It wasn't shaming or chiding. It was knowing, understanding. We're used to hard truths being things that disqualify us or put our standing in jeopardy. It's why we often keep the hard parts of our lives hidden in darkness. It seems like the easiest way to mitigate their impact. But when truth is held together with grace, it isn't punitive. It's restorative, because Jesus brings truth in a way that leads to life. This woman doesn't have to hide. She doesn't have to be in the dark because light has come to her, and now she can see herself the way God sees her, and she can see Jesus for who he really is. She went on to say, I know that Messiah who is coming, when he comes, he will explain everything to us. And Jesus declared, I, the one speaking to you, am he. And at this moment, everything changes. And it's another wild point of contrast with Nicodemus' story. He's this revered figure and is on the receiving end of one of the most popular teachings of all time. You think at the very least he'd run off to a football stadium with some signs or something. But his story just kind of ends there. Jesus invites him into the light, but he continues into the shadow. There's no movement. He's just learned the most important news of all time, the thing that his people had been longing for centuries, and he runs right out and he tells no one. Yet for this unnamed Samaritan woman, she takes the grace and truth of Jesus and she runs with it, literally. She books it back to her town because she has to get the word out about Jesus. Her community, this community that has shunned and scorned her, needs to know. Maybe they'll shame and ridicule her some more, but in the end, she doesn't care. This is too important. She exclaims, "Come, see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Messiah?" I admit, this is an unconventional message. Doesn't seem like it would spark any kind of spiritual movement, and yet it does. It's real and honest, and most importantly, it's centered on Jesus. It's a message, a person that is wrapped in grace and truth. And as a result of her encounter with Jesus, it's this woman, not Nicodemus, who becomes the first preacher, the first missionary in John's gospel. And what do we see? Many of the Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. He told me everything I ever did. So when the Samaritans came to him, they urged him to stay with them, and he stayed 2 days. And because of his words, many more became believers. This is why Jesus had to go to Samaria. It's what his kingdom is all about. Small things making great impact. Be like that soccer ball hitting the peloton, but obviously better. Grace and truth that multiplies. Moments that become movements. And this can be for us too. Not just stories we read about, but stories we live. It starts with receiving Jesus' grace and truth for the gifts that they are. Free grace that loves, blesses, forgives, includes. truth that doesn't condemn but provides assurance and the safety to change when needed. When we have experienced that from Jesus, then it totally makes sense that we would want the villages around us to experience it as well. This spring, in addition to replanting our congregations, we're planning to launch micro-churches as communities for discipleship and mission in places that are otherwise hard for us to reach. Recently, I spoke with a couple who has a heart for their neighborhood. And the husband remarked that these pandemic months have created moments for connection with his neighbors that he never had before. So we got to dream and pray about what it could look like for those moments to turn into movements of grace right there on their street. So I was so excited to get to share my friend Patch's story with you today. Patch and I met at our gym. We never had deep conversations beyond, so we live, bro. But this pandemic created a moment of opportunity for him. He asked about ways to connect with our church, ended up joining a Bible study running out of High Rock, Cambridge. And as you heard, his encounters with Jesus sparked something new in his life, which overflowed into his cohort at Officer Candidate School. What began as a group of just a couple guys meeting each day for a devotional turned into close to a dozen. Moments into movements. I could keep sharing stories that I and other High Rockers have experienced in this vein, but I want to acknowledge that for a decent number of us, the topic of sharing our faith is loaded. There are a lot of good reasons for that. Reasons that I've probably embodied myself at many points. One of the big ones is that I thought for a long time, I thought helping someone develop a relationship with Jesus was really code for helping them become more like me. It was more like come and meet this man, which translates to come and meet this culture, these expectations, these rules. It was costly grace, which means that it wasn't grace at all. It was the very stuff that Jesus was freeing the woman from the well from. If we're going to work towards movements of grace and truth that multiply, it means that we have to learn how to truthfully say, come and see this man, Jesus. All we are signs pointing people to the ones that knows and loves us, knows them and loves them. So we all need to learn how to be as faithful a sign as possible, which means untangling Jesus from the junk that has been put onto him. And this might mean our culture, our traditions, our preferences, our entitlements. If talking about Jesus feels problematic for you, then the solution isn't to stop talking about Jesus. It's to talk about Jesus, the real one, the one full of grace and truth. And there are a lot of High Rockers who are learning how to do this together. And if you're feeling alone in this process, reach out to one of our pastors so we can get you connected. For everyone else, all you have to do is exactly what the Samaritan woman did. Share what Jesus has done for you. How has God been present in your life? What are the moments in which you experienced the grace of Christ? Those moments when your spiritual thirst finally felt satisfied because you experienced God granting you spiritual life like water springing up in you. It's great that you've heard the Samaritan woman's story of her encounter with Jesus and heard Patch's story, but what is your story? Friends, this story of God coming into the world, bringing light into darkness, sending a movement of grace and truth exploding throughout history, your story is a part of this story. Even if you feel small or afraid or unsure, even if you have been told that Jesus is not for you, that your history is too complicated, that you can't possibly be of use, you may have a part to play in the story that is larger than you could have ever imagined. Just like this woman. Soccer balls into pelotons, moments into movements. This is what happens when we experience and respond to the grace and truth of Jesus.